Well, I don't know about you, but I thought that the level of sophistication and information that we got over the course of this morning was so great that I have moved to an even higher elevation of confusion about the situation in Syria than was the case before. It is a complicated part of the world, to say the least, and it's one I spent much of my career in. I didn't serve in Syria, but I served 9 years in Jordan and 9 years in Lebanon, all totaled. And I lived in Israel, and of course Syria is a major factor of life for all of those countries. I also, I think we'll come to this in the Q&A, but I also think it's important to bear in mind the fact that Syrian history, we didn't cover too much of that, and Americans, as someone said, we don't like, I think it was the governor, we don't like a lot of history. But the fact is, if you don't understand Syrian history, you're not going to understand Syria today. And for most of its modern history, since the collapse of the Ottoman Empire in World War I, has been one of chaos. It was only during, and I'm not a fan of the al-Assad family, but it's a fact of life that authoritarians somehow can bring order to things that others can't. And when they weren't around, Syria was one of the most ungovernable places in the world. And it's very important to bear that in mind as people try to pick up the pieces left by the Assad debacle today. A third point I have in mind is that, it's great that the good news is the Assads are gone and they're gone for good. The bad news is they've been replaced by a Takfiri Salafist who not long ago was planning suicide bombings on a regular basis to be conducted by his followers. And while we all want him to show that he's a chameleon who will at some point anyway, land in a permanent new coloration like ours, you got to take that with a big grain of salt, given the history here. And this is a man who we watch, wearing his fighter camis when he's out there with the HTS boys in the morning, and then he puts on his Armani suit for lunch for the EU delegation in the afternoon, and then he puts on his Parisian night clothes for the interviews with the BBC and the Atlantic and all the cool club guys. This is what we're dealing with. So he's a very adept at it, and maybe that will be working. But again, at some point, the moment of truth will occur in which he has to declare his color. And is he going to make that clean break that I think the United States should expect, and others who care about stability in that part of the world, the clean break from his Salafi past and from the foreign fighters as well as the Syrian fighters who continue to back him and brought him to power? And how is he going to make that clean break? And how can the United States help facilitate it without being sort of suckers, basically, and buying into this when there's really nothing to be bought into? And I've been struck by, since October 7, a theme that I think is very important to reinforce is that new realities require new thinking. And unfortunately, bureaucracies and even human nature are such that we tend to fall back on conventional thinking, even though we're facing new realities. And we are facing new realities, and so a lot of the old think isn't necessarily going to work. Doesn't mean we throw everything out the window, but it does mean that there has to be some freshness to this. And that's why what you're doing today is so welcome. Because I tried when I was at the Wilson Center before it went up in a cloud of smoke, and the ATFL, which is a Lebanese group that I've been very involved in, Lebanese Americans, to try to launch talks about the Syrian problem from the perspective of the Syrian refugees in Lebanon. And there was absolutely no interest in this city in doing it. I was told pretty much directly, my words, but the message was America's policy is to have no policy, right? We do not want to have a Syria policy. It's too hard. Well, you were the first group that I have seen come together with the rich range of think tanks that you've identified to actually begin this conversation in a serious way. So thank you very much for doing that. One or two things I want to leave you with before we start the lunch, though, and then we can come back to this Q&A, is that yes, Turkey has the upper hand, but again, going back to history, the antagonism between Turks and Arabs is for real. It is historic, it's cultural, it's political, it's economic. It is why MBS, one of the reasons why MBS did what he did in deploying President Trump in the way he did, was even though if he may have sounded a lot like Erdogan in the ambition and goals for Syria, in fact, it is an element of the competition going on between the capital of the Arab world today, which is Riyadh, and the Turks, of course. The other question, I would ask us to think about and then come back to is what happened when when Ahmadinejad and his groups took over? Well, it was because Assad couldn't get Putin to answer the phone, right? Putin basically was too tied down in Ukraine. So there's a very important development that had nothing to do with Syria per se that led to these consequences, which feeds into the theme of particularly the last discussion led by Ambassador Gilmore of, is Syria going to be the landscape for regional competition for the foreseeable future? And I think the answer is absolutely yes. It was even before this event. That was what was happening. Bashar al-Assad couldn't handle it, unlike his father. And so you had Iran, you had the Turks, you had the Kurds, you had the United States, you had the Israelis, you had the Russians, all of these forces already in play even before Assad fell. And to wish that's going to go away, now that we all have this hopeful moment, is probably a little bit naive. And so I think the question is going to be, how are we going to manage this regional conflict under the circumstances that we're dealing with? And I think that is very real that we're going to face a bandwidth problem, which was alluded to at the end of the discussion today about donor capacity and recovery capacity with Syria, Lebanon, Ukraine, Gaza all in play. But I think that the big check writers of the Middle East are the Saudis and the Emiratis and the Qataris. And my guess is Syria's on the top of their list way above Gaza. They may pay excuse me, I don't know if it's disturbing to you, pay lip service to Gaza, but I don't think the check writing is going to be anything like it's going to be for Syria, because Syria is where their competition comes into play. The point I was making earlier. They're not going to compete in Gaza. This is an Israeli tale. And so the question for us is, what is President Trump going to make of all of this? And for how long is he going to have attention span on it? And how does the MAGA world look at an emerging crisis or opportunity, however you want to put it, such as Syria? And you all are far more attuned. I'm a career guy, as you know, and you are not, and you are far more attuned to American politics than I would have ever been. But my guess is that an essence of MAGA, anyway, when it comes to foreign policy is we're not rushing into obligations unless you really convince us that there is something at stake here that really requires America to put its interests on the line, to put its assets and resources on the line, and it's up to the local players. Which brings us back to my point about the landscape for regional conflicts, which we're going to face. The last point I want to make before we eat is the pivot to China, pivot to Asia. As a Middle East guy, I always was a little bit perplexed by the rhetoric, which goes back, by the way, all the way to the Clinton administration. This was not something that the Obama team came up with. Kurt Campbell was the DAS-D at the time, and he was very much pushing for this. And it was, I think, a logical recognition that our military, there was a sort of imbalance in the military distribution of our resources, and that we were missing out in East Asia, and I think that's still true today. But great power competition is going to be a matter of global competition, right? And guess where it's going to be? It's going to, to a large degree, be in the Middle East. So the idea that we can suddenly abandon our interests or let the Saudis and the Israelis handle it all for us is crazy. I mean, the Chinese then will potentially get some advantages. And by the way, our influence in the Middle East is incredible. I remember there was an article, remember that day when we woke up and the Chinese had apparently negotiated the reestablishment of relations between Iran and Saudi Arabia, and all the news headlines were that America's lost out and that, now the new boys on the block. Well, when October 7 happened, where were the Chinese? When Syria fell apart, where were the Chinese? It's always the United States still today. And that is a good thing in a part of the world where energy, economic interests, where transit, as we've seen in the Red Sea, old school transportation waterways still matter. And that's all about the Middle East. And of course, the center of three monotheistic faiths, which will always make it of interest to any member of those faiths wherever they live, United States, Europe, or the Middle East. So I will leave you to chew on some of that stuff while we chew on real food and come back to it for Q&A. Thank you. Continue the discussion. I think I made my main points, and I'm looking at something for an entirely different event. So if I didn't make them, I've forgotten them anyway. But really to hear from you, I mean, you've been such a patient group, and I really praise the council for not just the moment you've chosen to do this when others weren't, but the level of sophistication in the conversation this morning, which you can only expect, obviously, from Council of Ambassadors, but there it was anyway, and worth applauding. So What's on your minds, sir?
Let's go back to MBS people. Given what I know about him, which is really not very much, other than what the Washington Post has emphasized. I don't think of him as much of a statesman, but I gather from what you're saying that he wields a significant amount of influence in the Middle East. Could you elaborate a little bit on his current role and the potential role that MBS has in the region and perhaps on a broader scale?
Yeah. Well, I think MBS has matured greatly in his time as the de facto ruler of Saudi Arabia. And I was mentioning at the table, I had the extraordinary opportunity to accompany Secretary of State Pompeo after the Khashoggi assassination on a whirlwind trip we took to meet with Erdogan at the Istanbul airport, and then to spend basically a day and an evening with MBS. And that was my real insight into the guy.
Did he do it?
Yeah, he did. I'm afraid he did. He didn't quite say so, but he said their system fell down. But not only do you learn, if you are going to murder the opposition, don't do it in Turkey, and don't do it while the Turks have the room bugged, and do it a little more cleverly. But more important than that, I think he's the impetuous nature of his national security approach when he first came into office, which we followed him all, started to mellow. And it mellowed for a lot of reasons. I think Khashoggi was one factor. Also, that the ambitions they had about Yemen proved unreachable. And I think they realized there was a lot of American pressure too, but I think on their own they came to the conclusion that they had to have a diplomatic and political game, and not a military approach to Yemen. No one can quite fix Yemen. So, and I think he also turned to what should be Saudi Arabia's priority, which is the domestic situation in the country and the need to reform fundamentally that society, so that it can survive the change, whatever changes occur in the energy market over the next generations, and bring it into modern life. I've been going to Saudi Arabia since my first assignment there in 1985. It is fundamentally different in many, many ways, particularly the freedom of women and the atmosphere and environment you get when you go to public places where Saudi families and Saudi singles, women and men, are enjoying each other just the way we would in downtown Washington, which was not at all the case in the 1980s. And I read somebody saying that they're even going to have alcohol in Saudi Arabia, limited places, and just beer and wine. But to me, I remember I was a vice consul. My first tour, and my main job was to get Americans out of jail who were arrested when they were drunk at the same party I had been at, drinking. So, with my diplomatic immunity. But so I do think that's what's changed. He's a ruthless leader. He has eliminated the opposition within the royal family. I assume he has the upper hand on the military. I don't know. The tribal structure there is still complicated, and he seems to play that game very well. But he's focusing on internal development, and that's a good sign. His biggest problem, frankly, is A, Iran, and B, uncertainty about America. This is the historic difficulty. The relationship is intense, but the Saudis, time and again, and this is their point of view, I'm not defending it necessarily, is correct, but it is a perspective they have, which is the United States doesn't always live up to its commitments, doesn't always show up when we say we're going to show up. And whenever, a Dick Cheney goes as SecDef in 1990 to Saudi Arabia to convince them that we want to liberate Kuwait, the first answer is, what about day two? Bandar's questions. What happens after that? Are you really going to be with us? And we persuaded them we were, and we got our way. Those are the questions that I'm sure is going through conversations that were held in Riyadh this last week. Was MBS may be more gentle in the question, but basically assessing the continuity and consistency of the United States approach to security in the Gulf.
Yeah. I got my microphone. I'm sorry. My apologies. Israel. I'd be interested in your take on where we are with Israel, where Israel is with Israel, and kind of where we're going. That's the question.
Yeah. I'm glad. I really wanted to touch on that because I think the panels were great, but I don't know that we've fully got our arms around the Israeli dimension as it relates to Syria and the region, because the Israelis themselves haven't fully gotten their arms around it. I mentioned that new realities require new thinking. October 7 shook to the bone the Israelis, their psychology, their national security strategy. They realize that new realities are in front of them, and they should have realized them sooner. And there will be accountability, by the way, more than we've seen, I think, at some point among their leaders. But they haven't quite, they're groping for the new national security strategy, but I don't think they've settled on it yet. What we're beginning to see are things like, not waiting to be attacked, total preemption, a complete disregard for international public opinion. They don't care less. Doesn't matter one bit what the ICC or the UN or a bunch of political parties somewhere in the world think. Doesn't matter. America matters, clearly. That's a constant. But they've also learned that American presidents may, the Biden administration had a kind of a split personality on this issue because of its internal politics. But that at the end of the day, the Americans were gave them what they wanted, so enabled them to do what they felt they needed to do. And then what we're seeing in Gaza today, though, is also an erosion of past Israeli distaste for occupation. Remember, they got out of Gaza, they got out of South Lebanon. West Bank's a different matter. That's much more existential. And that is changing, and I'm not sure it's a good change, because it raises the question, well, what are you going to do? In that part, there's no answer. No one has come up with an answer as to what's going to happen in Gaza: governance, security, and economic reconstruction. And then coming to the point of the discussion today on Syria is that I completely sympathize with the Israeli perspective that you heard me being very skeptical about Sharaa. I hope he succeeds. I hope he changes. But they probably see him the way I do, and also are very familiar with Syrian history. I mean, they've lived it. They're right next door. And so the idea that you're going to convince the Israelis to cut Sharaa slack, or do things that could create vulnerabilities for their security in the hope that in the long run it will create a better situation in Syria, you'd be laughed out of most conferences or settings in Israel, and saying, what about October 7th? It's a whole new world. So we're not going to wait. We're going to find our allies. The Druze have been reliable allies. Work with the Druze, and let's make a free field of fire in South Syria, which is relatively flat. The Israelis can handle it, they think, by the air. So I think that's what they're going to do. And the question then that we should be having with them is, if we have a different strategy, is to outline what it is going to be, why what they're doing may be undercutting some of that. If we do want to try at least give Sharaa a chance to succeed, should the Israelis be quite as aggressive as they're being? Tough conversation, because again, after October 7, the frame of psychology is so different for them. They're not going to be easily persuaded that our course of action is smarter than theirs. Sir?
That means Hamas.
We can hear it.
Okay. This means that Hamas won. Their goal was to disrupt Israeli foreign policy and to make them react in a way that they would become pariahs worldwide. The international media community is beating the hell out of Israel every day. I was on BBC the other day sort of defending them, and the media weren't. So the attack on Israel and the response that Israel was goaded into has been negative for Israel. Hamas won with their attack. What do you think about that?
Yeah, no, I think, I don't know that I know exactly why Hamas did what they did, but it's certainly, and someone put this extremely well earlier today, I think it was Mike Duran, it was Lister from the MEI. If your goal is to bring Iran back into the Levant after all the successes of the IDF, then the current Israeli post-war strategy is working perfectly. Because these kinds of approaches, after the enormous sacrifices and advantages gained by the IDF over the course of the campaign, could be thrown away by an ill-thought-through post-war strategy. How do you stabilize these situations? And if you don't stabilize them, then the jungle's going to grow back. The enemies will grow back. So that's our role. I mean, I've always believed our role is not to tell our friends the Israelis how to fight a war, because then we bear the responsibilities of the choices that they made in the conduct of the war. Our role is to help them understand when it's time to make peace, or if it's not peace, at least to end the conflict, and how to stabilize the situation after. And it's completely legitimate because our interests are at stake in that as well. And I think that's where we're falling down. And by the way, I'm not an advocate right now of a two-state solution or rushing to idealistic things that didn't work, didn't deliver in the past. But leaving Gaza or South Lebanon or southern Syria to their own devices is a prescription for disaster.
David, I have two questions, and they both have to do with something you profess no expertise about, politics. Politics in Israel. Would Israel be able to have a different policy and approach? And by the way, I speak as somebody who is not at all hostile to Likud governments or anything like that. I'm conservative and generally hard line. But would Israel have a different policy approach potentially to the transition in Syria if it had a different government? Or if it could have a different government? How much, put differently, how much of the response to Syria's situation is really intended to generate a favorable feedback loop in Israeli politics, regardless of what it means on the ground? And secondly, about our politics, it is sometimes said that there's a somewhat schizophrenic view of American foreign policy inside the Trump administration, that there is a kind of a isolationist wing, if you would, and there is still unquestionably an internationalist wing to Republican politics. But in this case, most people, except those who are complete isolationists, would say this kind of radical change after 50 years in Syria is an unbelievable opportunity. We must do something to take advantage of it. But do you think we will, given the schizophrenia?
Yeah. I don't think we know the answers to either of those questions, but it's really important to discuss them.
Well, that's your question.
Yes. I'll give you my thoughts on it, and it's been consistent since October 7 because I thought there was a rush to somehow personalize this and blame Bibi for Netanyahu for anything that was happening, and that somehow whatever he was doing was a devious plan to keep himself out of jail or out of the courts, and it was not my reading, and it isn't today. I don't think that's what he's doing. I think there may be aspects of this that help him in that respect, but Israeli politics have shifted in our lifetime. Bibi Netanyahu hasn't changed at all. He was a far right when he first came into power in the Clinton administration, 1997, after Peres, and he defeated Peres. Now he's kind of in the center of Israeli politics. He hasn't changed. Israeli politics have changed. And I don't think there's any conceivable coalition that could gain a majority in the Knesset today that would have conducted the war, and I conduct the post-war period fundamentally differently than he has. Now, I think what I would say perhaps differently, and again, I say this with enormous respect and sympathy and humility that I know I didn't, thank God, have to live through October 7, is that the psychological impact of that has made it very hard to introduce nuance, okay? And so, and particularly after these overwhelming successes against Iran that I don't think any Israelis who weren't involved in the actual planning of the war thought would ever be pulled off, is that there's also a little bit of hubris that comes with that. And so a sense that, well, we can handle it. We can handle anything. Maybe they can. But there are probably smarter ways to deal with these. I already touched on it, the three areas around their neighborhood, southern Syria, southern Lebanon, and Gaza, where I don't think they're on the right course, but I also don't think that Israeli politics are going to be easily shifted to enable us to find solutions there. That's the problem. So again, that's where the United States, as the big brother, the big partner, can come in with good ideas that are feasible, not, this is, again, my problem with Blinken and Biden was that anytime they talked about the future, they would just fall back on conventional thinking like a two-state solution, which is so far from reality now and what's possible, not just among Israelis, but Palestinians. The public is, neither public is anywhere near supporting a two-state solution. So we got to come up with things that actually could work. And one of my ideas on Gaza is it's fascinating to watch that Europeans, Americans, Arabs, states, we all have our ideas on what should happen in Gaza. No one's ever asked anybody who lives in Gaza what it is that they want. And for the most part, they're not pro-Hamas. The opinion polling when I was in office anyway showed that if you were a Palestinian living in Gaza, you supported Fatah, who ruled in the West Bank, and if you were a Palestinian living in the West Bank, you favored Hamas, who were living in Gaza. You follow the logic there. So what about a grassroots approach where you're actually talking to people who are the policemen and the doctors and the lawyers, maybe not the lawyers, the school teachers, the health workers, nurses. These are the people who actually have legitimacy because they stuck it through. Yeah. They paid the price that everybody in their neighborhood paid. And they have credibility in Arab society because they're professionals or they're service providers. And they probably have some practical ideas. Instead of going, our traditional thinking has been you build a Palestinian state from the top down. Well, that didn't work, okay? I am a clear exhibit of somebody who spent a lot of time trying to make it work, didn't work. What about the grassroots, bottom up? We actually have a chance now. And that's
we haven't heard from them.
Because no one can access them in a way, but also I don't know if anyone has ever said what I just said as a way to go about this. And so, and I'm no genius, I'm sure there are 1,000 things wrong with what I just said, but this is the kind of new thinking I'm saying that needs to be introduced into this, and particularly asking the people who've just gone through this, not what do you need, and the first answer is going to be water and food, but what do you need to get back on your feet and have a sustainable life? And I'd be very interested in what the answers to that are. You asked about American politics. I don't know. I mean, I think that it'd be interesting as a thought experiment. What if Syria had, the opportunity in Syria had somehow manifested itself 15 years ago, what would we be doing? We'd be much more actively involved than is the case today, undoubtedly. So I think there's been a scar tissue that's developed because of the Iraq and Afghan experiences that make Americans shy about this part of the world. Plus Syria's, it's a weird, unknown place, complicated. So we have an educational role in explaining to Americans what are the limits of American influence, but what are the opportunities for American influence in partnership with MBS. Just getting back to the point about this is the center of the Arab world. They are mostly like-minded, and we can work with them and with Israel and manage the Turks. I turn to you. I mean, I think it's a hard sell, but I was a witness at a HVAC hearing last week or 2 weeks ago, and I was surprised at the level of internationalism on the Republican side in the House. I wasn't expecting it. The Senate, you figure that's still there. Even in the House, there is an element of that. There's a lot of unhappiness about AID. Not that I'm a fan of AID, by the way, as an organization, but a lot of unhappiness at that image and that reality of an American withdrawal, as Ryan Crocker said this morning. Just when we need tools like that in a place like Syria, we suddenly don't have them. And this is really unfortunate. So.
Hale. Hi, thank you very much for your remarks today. And if I may say, in the region, you have a very sterling reputation for being a great statesman. So thank you for that. I wanted to bring it back to Syria on a topic that I think is concerning many Syrians today, I've heard on the ground, which is that of the potential for a rise in jihadism and a more religious Syrian state. As you alluded to earlier in your remarks, and I think maybe has been spoken of during the panel, Syria is a very multi-ethnic, multi-religious community. And so many Syrians are very concerned about some reports that men and women have been unable to walk across the street holding hands as they usually would have, or women are being forced to adopt a more cultural interpretation of Islam that is more extremist. We saw during the conflict that there was funding by many actors in the Gulf of more extremist versions and interpretations of Islam through the madrasas. And as you alluded to, al-Sharaa, his real doctrine is Salafism. And so my question to you, and more broadly that I think we all should also be thinking about, is what is the role of the United States or the West in this process in ensuring that jihadism doesn't spread across the region, doesn't flourish as a result of his ascension to power, and how we might be able to guide this process such that that's not as much of a concern and religious liberty could sustain. So just a broad question on your forecast.
Yeah. No, those fears are, well, I think, are legitimate to have, and they're the fears that a lot of the Syrian minorities who are, who may not have liked Assad, but Assad did protect them somewhat from those elements, and that's gone, and now they're scared. And you certainly feel it in Lebanon for the same reasons, although President Aoun and al-Sharaa have met, and they're trying to establish some kind of regime at the border, so that's all to the good. But it goes back to that fundamental question, which none of us are really able to answer, but it's got to keep being asked and tested, is what is al-Sharaa? What is he about? And I thought Daniel Pletka was also right in saying it's, one man, one person isn't going to change the future direction of Syria, but that's what we have to work with. And so what is he going to do to change these historic forces? And if he understands as in a sophisticated way as he presents, what is he actually doing to counter these elements? And if he does, that's when we should pour in the support. Say, yeah, you've proved yourself to us. So that's what we pour in. We lift the sanctions and we pour in, if we don't have AID, we still have the World Bank. We still have other tools to use in this regard. And of course, the Saudis should be the big check writers anyway. And to show that that's the right wave. Because a lot of what my experience in my period, for what it's worth, in the Middle East throughout all this tumultuous time, is never underestimate two things that are related. The momentum that organizations like Al-Qaeda or ISIS or whatever flavor you're dealing with gains, and therefore people join them not necessarily out of conviction but out of self-protection. And secondly, with the related thing is the vacuum in the Arab state system. These are fragile states that never really existed the way they look on a map. And they are regimes that lack legitimacy because they are unelected for the most part, and they have historically underinvested in the welfare of their people. Levels of education, levels of healthcare, every measure you can think of. In the year after 9/11, there was a report done by UNDP by Arab scholars that showcased this absence, even in the Gulf. And if you were to do that report today, I don't think you'd see much progress. So this is still a problem. And those are the things that make these societies vulnerable to these radical extremist movements, and those are the things we should be working on to change. Not that it's our job to fix these Middle Eastern states, but we should understand what's at stake and try to help them get in the right place, which is exactly the moment we have in Syria today. So.
Well, Ambassador Hale, David, thank you so much. You've let us overrun your hard stop time.
Thank you.
But we're very grateful to you for being here, sharing your company with us, sharing your wisdom and knowledge and insights with us. We have a little token of our appreciation for you.
Lovely.
It may join another one so that it's not lonely on your shelf. And we look forward to, I will look forward to seeing you around campus.
Anytime.
Okay.
Thank you. Thanks Philip.
So much.
Thanks, everyone.
And thanks to all of you for coming. I made a remark yesterday about something we need desperately in the Council of American Ambassadors, and that is those who follow the Woody Allen principle, that 80% of life is showing up. You obviously are all devotees, as I am, of the Woody Allen principle. You showed up. So we've had a successful conference with great speakers, and I think, if I may say, great insights, a wealth of insights, but made all the richer by your participation. So keep it up. We'll be doing this again in the fall. Thanks so much.